If the Prime Minister is so sure that he did nothing wrong, will he appear before the Justice Committee to explain his action?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The member from Vancouver Granville will be able to address relevant matters at the committee while ensuring that the two active court cases are not jeopardized.
The buck stops with him. So will he come to the Justice Committee? Will he finally stop evading? And will he answer some questions truthfully and openly?
We know that the Conservative leader met with representatives of the company. We know that the leader of the NDP met with representatives of the company. We know that the Conservative deputy leader herself said at Justice Committee, quote, "I do not want the impression to be on the record that I think there's anything wrong with meeting with SNC-Lavalin," unquote.
The Conservative opposition wants the Prime Minister to appear before the Justice Committee. They want him to answer questions on the SNC-Lavalin controversy. Meanwhile, former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould says she will accept that invitation, but with some conditions, including a 30-minute opening statement. What should we expect to hear, and will it finally answer the big questions in this whole thing? In Toronto, Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs joins us, along with Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister. She's in Montreal. Here with me in studio, Rachel Curran, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, now with Harper and Associates, and the CBC's own John Paul Tasker. Hello, everyone.
Hey,
nice to see you again. It's been so long. So I want to highlight two parts of the letter that Jody Wilson-Raybould wrote Anthony Howe's father, who is the chair of the Justice Committee, and then get you guys to weigh in. She essentially says the government can waive solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence. I cannot. I believe, she writes, that it would be useful for the committee to have before it an authoritative statement on the scope of that convention before I testify. And then at the end of the letter, she says, when I appear, I request the opportunity to make an extended opening statement of approximately 30 minutes, during which I propose to give the committee my best recollection of all the relevant communications about which I may properly testify. I will remain before the committee to answer questions for as long as the committee wishes. How do you read that, Brad?
Like it was a pretty darn good letter. I mean, she is playing a very smart communications game. Not only those that you highlighted, which are the most germane elements of that letter, but it was also the timing. Moments after, I think we were still on the air when that letter came out. There was Trudeau in the House of Commons saying, later today the government will confirm that the former Attorney General will be at Justice Committee, and then within minutes, she is setting the terms of her appearance, and those terms are pretty agreeable, in my opinion. For the people at home would say, well, yeah, I'd like to know what she's allowed to say and what she's not, particularly for the members of the Standing Committee of Justice, so that they can stay on point and not waste committee time asking questions that we'll all know. So if we all know the terms of the debate, then at least we'll know what's on point and what's not. And she then gets to defer the rules of engagement back to the government, as opposed to herself, where she might come across as saying, I don't want to answer that because it may or may not be within the rules. So very smart communications plan for her. And now she's tossed the ball back in Trudeau's court, and now we await the timing of her appearance, as well as some definition as to what's permitted and what is not.
Yeah, what the Prime Minister said in question period was that later today the government will confirm that the member from Vancouver Granville, Jody Wilson-Raybould, will be able to address relevant matters at the committee while ensuring that the two active court cases are not jeopardized. So what we are seeking clarity, we're anticipating clarity from the Prime Minister's office or from the government, is around how do you define and who defines relevant, along with what does ensuring the two court cases aren't jeopardized, what might that inhibit in Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony. What did you think of the Yolande, of the letter from Jody Wilson-Raybould stipulating, that she wants 30 minutes to lay out her case?
Well, I would agree with Brad's assessment of her from the very beginning, being able to control exactly her message and what she wants to say, what and when, that she wants to speak for 30 minutes in the beginning for opening remarks. Clearly, she wants to speak, and putting the burden back on the government to explain if there are restrictions with which they lift the solicitor confidentiality client privilege is fair. But I think the Prime Minister was also strong today in saying that it would be lifted. I don't see really the interest in the government announcing that today if they didn't really want her to speak. I feel like there's been this, and I understand why. I mean, it serves the opposition and a lot of people that want to allow Ms. Wilson-Raybould to kind of hide behind the confidentiality to say that she's being prohibited to speak. But once that's lifted, I think that in spite of the fact that this has been obviously very difficult for the government, at least you can begin to see an end in the sense that she will testify, the government will react, and then people will be able to come to some kind of conclusion as to who they believe in the whole story.
The only thing I would say to that, in all fair, is that why then we all sought clarification after that statement was made in the House, and they could have written back right away and said, "It's all lifted. Yeah. She can say whatever," you know, and that hasn't happened to be. But
they might still. There are two cases pending. Yeah. There are two cases.
No,
pending.
I know what you're saying, but it's still not.
But that is a legally. I mean, that's not just a frivolous thing. I mean, cases are dismissed all the time based on the fact that public information can cause an
I'm
impact
not
on it.
insinuating
That shouldn't be
the
minimized.
case. I'm just saying that they haven't clarified what they meant.
Oh, and then they're going to have to.
If they had, we wouldn't be, wondering if how fulsome it really is.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly the point. There's clearly still a real disconnect between what Trudeau says when he says, she can talk about relevant things, and what Jody Wilson-Raybould means when she says, I'm going to be able to talk about relevance. So there's still no agreement on what that is. And I think she clearly has avoided setting a date to testify until there is some clarity around that, because she wants to know what she can say, and rightfully so. So it sounds like there's still a bit of a gap, more than a bit of a gap, in the understanding between the two of them about what she is allowed to talk about and what she will talk about. And look, Yolande's made the point a couple of times that, of course, it's in the government's interest to clarify this and hear from her and let her speak. I don't think it is. Look, I think we are getting to the point now where when Jody Wilson-Raybould speaks, it looks like she is going to implicate Trudeau directly in this. And if she points the finger directly at the Prime Minister, that's going to put him in a really difficult position. We've already seen his principal secretary step down, resign from his position.
But at the same time, say he did nothing wrong.
Well, saying he did nothing wrong, but then why did he resign if he did nothing wrong? So that's where we're kind of the chicken and the egg, right? If he really did nothing wrong, why did he step down from his job? And so if she implicates the Prime Minister's staff, his principal secretary, and perhaps his chief of staff also, and at least one of them resigns, what happens when she implicates Trudeau directly? The other thing she may do is give, for instance, the RCMP enough to start an investigation, or at least to commence a formal inquiry into this. So I think having her speak is really going to take this up another level.
I think she obviously has a story to tell. I mean, asking for 30 minutes is a considerable period of time before a committee. Usually a witness would take 5, maybe 10 minutes to have introductory remarks to a committee, so she obviously has quite a long story to give. I think the best option here is to have the Prime Minister also appear before this committee. I think that's an entirely reasonable request. It doesn't happen very often in the Canadian House of Commons or in Canadian Parliament. The last time it happened was Stephen Harper, but not for a scandal. It was in 2006 when he went to the Senate committee studying reform. So there is a precedent for this. He could go...
To be fair, though, I think he was also tried to call them before...
He was called for the Nigel Wright affair, and he didn't appear. So there's obviously a record of people only going when it's convenient for them. But why doesn't Justin Trudeau take a different stance?
Well, he hasn't said that he won't, to be fair.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's obviously on the table. I mean, Michael Wernick, the most senior bureaucrat in this country, went to the committee to give his whole side of the story. And in fact, I think it was good for the government when he did that, because he spoke in plain terms. He shed some light on what went down in the Prime Minister's office when all these discussions were going on. He talked like a normal person, not just in sound bites and behind legalese. He gave some indication as to what actually went down, admitted that there was some conversations where he said that there would be consequences for Jody Wilson-Raybould if she did not go ahead with the DPA.
Not to her, but to the
company in general. But he did give us, he shed some light on what was going on. And I think that the Prime Minister should be well equipped to handle a parliamentary committee of this sort and give his side of the story.
Brad, going back to what Rachel said about the potential impact of Jody Wilson-Raybould, do you think the government doesn't want her to say anything? I mean, they have been pretty insistent in their defense that they didn't do anything wrong, that the allegations are they've even said defamatory at one point. So if that is the case, if they believe so much so that they didn't do anything wrong, what damage could she still do to them?
Well, any contradictions of what the clerk of the Privy Council said at committee last week could be damaging. Now, again, we take it at the character of the witnesses here. I mean, right now, her stock in the eyes of most Canadians is higher than it was before all this. I think a lot of people want to trust her, want to believe her story. And it obviously doesn't make the Prime Minister look very good where, he's had these the big pillars of his last election were on, rights for Indigenous peoples, women's equality, and transparency. So these three things all come to a bit of a crash in this SNC-Lavalin saga. I don't think they'll put Trudeau at committee. I think if they want to have another sharpshooter to defend what's been happening, then they'll put up Jerry Butts. One of the reasons why they cited that he was going to resign, if he'd done nothing wrong, then why did you resign? And the sources within the Prime Minister's office were saying, so he can defend himself. Well, there's no better platform for him to actually say, hey, Justice Committee, if you're going to have Ms. Wilson-Raybould, please invite me back. I mean, I think there was a motion before to have some senior staff members.
Yeah.
That was shut down. But now that he stepped down from his position and they saw a little bit of juice coming out of the clerk of the Privy Councils, he would be a much better witness on the Trudeau camp than Trudeau himself. I mean, that would be a real, that would be a good power in politics session in the middle of the day. Please invite the power panel back for...
Oh, we will. Don't you worry if that happens. Yolande, what do you think about that?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, it's obviously there's a lot of questions, but we can't presume to know the answers before people have actually said what they've had to say. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that Jody Wilson-Raybould testifying in committee is going to be a party for the government. Obviously, it'll be a difficult time for them. But if you have to compare between her speaking or continuing to go on with the insinuation that if she's not allowed to speak, that they're hiding something, I'm going to bet with go. Let her speak as widely as possible, as long as obviously that assessment has to be made on the current court proceedings. And you give your response. I mean, if there's one thing that I have to say the government really lacked from the beginning is they've acted on the defensive from the beginning. And from the very beginning, I feel like the government should have been much more proactive on the fact that it's public, the meetings that they had with SNC-Lavalin. It's public that the omnibus bill was adopted, and that there were discussions with respect to that, but that the law was respected. Instead of trying to reconcile a relationship with Ms. Wilson-Raybould that clearly wasn't going to happen. So hopefully tomorrow will be a beginning of a turning point for them.
Welcome back to Power in Politics and the Power Panel. Brad Levine, Yolande James, Rachel Kern, and JP Tasker are all with us. We're talking, of course, about the possibility of Jody Wilson-Raybould testifying before the Justice Committee. She says she'd like to make a 30-minute opening statement, but we're awaiting clarification on solicitor-client privilege and to what degree the Prime Minister and government will waive that.
Right, and so it's obviously an open question as to whether he allows her to speak freely. Will she be bound by any of this privilege at all? That's, there's some wiggle room there for the Prime Minister, frankly, on all this. But no matter who testifies, I think there's a possibility there's just no clean resolution to this affair, to this scandal. I think there are sufficient shades of gray. It's possible that we never really get a definition of what was pressure and what was inappropriate pressure, and whether this was the right thing for the PCO and the Prime Minister's office to do. I think that we might come to a point where there's no nice little neat bow on this present. We might just have to take both at their word that they felt they were acting appropriately and that the Prime Minister did nothing wrong. I mean, there is a very real chance of that happening. I mean, she might have a tape or some other bombshell revelations to bring to committee when she does actually get there. But as it stands now, it's entirely possible that we don't really know how this all comes to an end. They might just each have a chance to make their point.
Do you think, Rachel, it's possible that two things can be true, that the Prime Minister's office and officials within it don't feel that they exerted unlawful pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould, and she can at the same time feel as though they did?
Sure, yeah, I can think, I'm sure that they do believe, or at least they're arguing that they didn't exert inappropriate or undue pressure. The problem is that that's not the test when it comes to criminal obstruction of justice. The test is, was there interference in any manner with a criminal prosecution? And so I'm not sure that undue pressure or inappropriate influence is actually the right standard that should be applied, and maybe they'll argue that it is. But look, with 30 minutes, Jody Wilson-Raybould, as JP pointed out, is asking for at least 3 times the normal length for an opening statement. It's going to be a barn burner of a statement. And I'm pretty sure that we're probably going to learn more new information that we didn't know before. She's been very strategic and very careful about how she's approached this entire thing, rolling out one new piece of information after another. So I have to think that this is going to be a very carefully drafted statement, and it's going to give us some new facts and new details that we didn't know before. And I actually think she may take a direct shot at Trudeau as well. So unclear what her ultimate objective is here, but I think we are going to get new information this week. The one real missing piece in all of this has been the words from Jody Wilson-Raybould herself. And once we get that, I think we're going to have a much clearer picture of what went on here.
I mean, we're all speculating, Yolande. It's hard not to. It's interesting stuff, but it is. I mean, if you look at the few things that we did hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould last week, it's not hard to see why her colleagues would be a bit confused. We know that she went to caucus, for example, on the Wednesday morning and said that she was still enthusiastic about being a Liberal, and then stood up in Parliament and said she couldn't vote on the motion because she wanted to be able to speak her truth. What do you think about that?
Well, it puts into light that she'll have to answer questions as well in terms of what decisions she made and why and what exactly happened. So, yes, it will certainly not be an easy time, as I mentioned, for the government. But a lot of people question Jody Wilson-Raybould's decision to resign only when she did and not at the moment that she felt that she was pressured by there was undue pressure by the government. And though there's been a lot of speculation, a lot of things, the Prime Minister himself was pretty clear on the fact that he did not direct her to, and that the decision was independently hers. So in that sense, I go back to my original point that, yes, it won't be easy. 30 minutes she certainly has a lot to say. And I do agree with the assessment that one can feel that they were pressured on one side, and then another party on the other side can feel like they did not pressure. And in the end, the people will decide, as they say. But it is, I believe, given as far as this has gone for the past 2 weeks, in the government's interest to be able to let her be heard, and then the government to respond, the Prime Minister directly. Whether he does that at committee, I'm not in agreement with that, considering that these things tend to turn into to trials as opposed to being parliamentary committees, which is what they're in place for under these circumstances. It's
interesting, Brad, because the government has said, right, that is one thing pretty much from the beginning that the Prime Minister has said. If someone felt that they were being unduly pressured or directed, they should have. They had an obligation, I think are the words that he used, to come and tell him. And then a lot of people from the Liberals have been saying, well, why didn't she resign if that was the case? They had an expert in committee today, Mary Condon, the interim dean at the Osgoode Hall Law School, who said that a decision to resign should only be taken as a last resort. They are getting some interesting perspective today from legal experts that might help shape, an actual decision that isn't so he said, she said, and more what was right, what was wrong.
Well, yeah, there's a couple different things. First of all, there's no criminal case at this point, so there's not going to be a verdict at the end of all this. One of the big places that this is all playing out in is the court of public opinion. And so, we can bring in the experts and listen to the law and try to understand what is pressure, what is undue pressure, and those important things. And that's the right place for the committee to explore. But for the folks at home, I don't think that they're all of these nuances are going to. There's not going to be enough time to digest. The issue is going to be: did the PM and his office behave inappropriately? Yes or no? Now, getting back to the issue of what we might learn out of Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony at Justice Committee. I mean, 30 minutes is a long time, and that's why today's letter was so brilliant, because if the Liberal-dominated committee, which is chaired by a Liberal and has a majority of Liberals on it, and has influence with the House Leader, the Whip, and of course the Prime Minister's office, if they do not give her the 30 minutes that she requested, that'll be another silencing activity of the PMO. He'll take another brand hit. But think about a 30-minute opening statement. That is a tremendous opportunity to lay out her story. And then when she said in that letter, I'll stay as long as the committee wants, I'll answer any of your questions. Look at the distinct differences between the two. The PMO has changed his story daily. He's lost his principal secretary to this matter already. He keeps jerking back and forth on matters of either telling her he should have come to her, or he apologized for not coming out against the editorial cartoons. The cabinet debated for 2 hours whether they should let her into it. I mean, these guys do not have their act together. And you take a look at her communication strategy. It's been very, very strong. And now, if they don't give her the time that she's asked for, it'll be another disadvantage PMO.
Okay, quickly, Rachel, and I got to take a
Yeah,
break.
look, I think what we're losing sight of in all of this is a really important principle, and that's the independence of prosecutorial discretion and the rule of law. So we're talking about, was there inappropriate pressure, undue pressure, all of that stuff. Think about whether if the Director of Public Prosecution had been deciding whether or not to prosecute someone proactively, and there was pressure from the PMO and officials and the Clerk of the Privy Council to commence a criminal prosecution against someone rather than to drop one. I think there would be a great deal of outrage if the Prime Minister's office and his officials and his staff were involved in trying to push a criminal prosecuting proactively. So yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
They can intervene as long as they make it public.
Putting on my former PMO hat, calling up the Attorney General about an ongoing criminal case or a criminal prosecution would have been a clear red line. That call would never have been made. So we're already past that line. And so when we're into debating whether or not the words exchanged were inappropriate or were undue pressure, I think we're already well over the line. And we're losing sight of that principle of prosecutorial independence, which is critical.
Okay, lots more to discuss on this, I'm sure, over the coming days.